A young nurse saved a man's life after losing her job. 5 hours later, 10 luxury cars appeared at her home. Margaret just clocked in for the day, unaware of what fate had in store for her. The hospital hallways buzzed with the usual chaos, doctors rushing from one room to another, nurses checking vitals, patients groaning in pain. It was just another shift, or so she thought. Then, the emergency doors burst open. A stretcher was wheeled in at breakneck speed, paramedics shouting vital stats as they struggled to keep the patient stable. Gunshot wounds. Multiple entry points. "We need immediate assistance," one of them barked. The air in the ER shifted, and unspoken tension thickened as the medical staff exchanged wary glances. Margaret's pulse quickened as she took in the sight before her. A man lay on the gurney, his white shirt soaked in blood, his breathing shallow. His face was pale, his body fighting to hold on. Time was slipping away. She instinctively moved forward, ready to assist, when a cold, authoritative voice cut through the room like a blade. "No police clearance, no treatment," the hospital manager declared, his expression unreadable, his arms crossed as if this was nothing more than another bureaucratic obstacle. Margaret froze. What? Her eyes darted across the room, searching for any sign of resistance from her colleagues. But the nurses and doctors hesitated, some lowering their gazes, others stepping back entirely. No one was willing to challenge the order. The beeping of the heart monitor was erratic. The patient was losing too much blood. He needed intervention now. Margaret's breathing became uneven as a war raged inside her. She had taken an oath to save lives. But she also knew how this hospital worked. Breaking protocol meant consequences. Her hands trembled at her sides. She looked at the man again, his chest barely rising. A few more minutes, and he'd be gone. Enough. Margaret grabbed a pair of gloves and reached for the medical supplies. A hush fell over the ER as she pulled the tray toward her and got to work. The sharp smell of antiseptic filled her nostrils as she stabilized his airway and applied pressure to stop the bleeding. Every movement was calculated, precise, fueled by instinct and adrenaline. A nurse hesitated before stepping forward. "Margaret, you can't." "I have to," she whispered, not looking up. The monitors beeped aggressively as she pushed forward, ignoring the silent stares around her. Every second counted. She could hear the manager breathing heavily behind her, but she didn't stop. She stitched the wounds, stabilized the patient, and monitored his vitals. The numbers on the screen began to steady. He was alive. For a moment, the room was silent except for the rhythmic beeping of the machines. Relief flooded her, but it was short-lived. A slow, deliberate clap echoed through the ER. Margaret turned to find the manager standing there, his expression cold as steel. "Well done, Nurse Margaret. You saved him. But you no longer work here." Her breath caught in her throat. The weight of his words sank in slowly. The sterile walls of the ER seemed to close in. The same hospital she had dedicated her life to had just thrown her away like she was nothing. The nurses averted their gazes. No one spoke. No one defended her. Margaret's fingers curled into fists, but she held her head high. If this was the price of saving a life, so be it. She removed her hospital badge, placed it on the counter, and walked out, her heart pounding, her future uncertain. Little did she know, fate had just set her on a path far greater than she could have ever imagined. Margaret wandered through the city, her steps slow and aimless. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement, but she barely noticed. Just hours ago, she had been a nurse. Now, she was nothing. Her fingers absent-mindedly brushed against the hospital ID tucked in her pocket. It was the only thing she had left from her time at the hospital. Besides the sting of betrayal, she had left behind her hospital badge on the counter, a final symbol of her departure. But the ID? She had kept it, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe some part of her wasn't ready to let go. She sighed, shaking off the thought as she found herself in the city park, a quiet refuge amidst the towering buildings. The laughter of children echoed in the distance. Joggers moved past her, and the crisp scent of freshly cut grass filled the air. Then, a sudden gasp. A thud. A cry of alarm. Margaret's head snapped toward the commotion. A small crowd had gathered near a park bench, their faces frozen in shock. Pushing through the onlookers, she saw him, an elderly man, his face pale, his hands trembling as he clutched his chest. He stumbled, then collapsed. Her heart lurched. Cardiac arrest. Margaret didn't think. She acted. "Someone call an ambulance," she shouted, already dropping to her knees. She pressed 2 fingers against his neck. No pulse. Time slowed. The world faded. It was just her and him now. Lacing her fingers together, She placed her hands in the center of his chest and began compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. The rhythmic pressure sent shock waves through her arms, but she didn't stop. The murmurs of the crowd blurred into white noise. "Come on," she whispered between compressions. "Stay with me." A woman nearby was sobbing. Someone else was filming. But Margaret only focused on the man beneath her hands, the life slipping through her fingers. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. She tilted his head back, pinched his nose, and breathed into his mouth. His chest rose and fell. She went again. 1, 2, 3, 4. Seconds felt like hours. Then, a sudden, shuddering gasp. Margaret's hand stilled. The man's eyelids fluttered, his body jerking slightly before his breathing evened out. He was alive. A collective exhale swept through the crowd. People murmured in amazement. The sirens of an approaching ambulance rang through the air. Margaret sat back, her pulse pounding in her ears. The adrenaline still surged through her veins, but the relief was overwhelming. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. His eyes barely opened, but he nodded. A man in an expensive-looking suit suddenly knelt beside her. The personal assistant. He had been there the whole time, watching in helpless horror. Now, his expression was a mixture of gratitude and awe. "Miss," he said, clearing his throat, "you saved his life. Please, may I have your contact information, just in case Mr. Combs needs anything?" Margaret hesitated. Combs. The name rang a bell, but she was too drained to think. She glanced down at herself, her scrubs, now wrinkled and stained from the day's events. Her fingers brushed against the hospital ID still in her pocket. She pulled it out and handed it over. "Here," she said simply. The assistant took it carefully, nodding in thanks. As the paramedics arrived and took over, Margaret stood and dusted herself off. The crowd was still watching her, whispering among themselves. She didn't wait around. She had done what she could. With one last glance at the ambulance doors closing behind Isaac Combs, Margaret turned and walked away, unaware that this single moment would change her life forever. Later that day, Margaret sat in her tiny apartment, staring at the peeling ceiling. The events of the day weighed heavily on her, pressing down like an invisible force. No job, no certainty, just a choice, a reckless, impulsive, but necessary choice that had cost her everything. Her small living space felt even smaller now. The dim light from the single lamp cast long shadows across the walls, flickering slightly from the occasional hum of an old refrigerator. She hugged a throw pillow to her chest, mind racing. Would she ever work as a nurse again? Would anyone hire someone who had defied hospital policy so openly? Her stomach growled, snapping her back to reality. She hadn't eaten all day. Sighing, she pushed herself up from the couch and made her way to the kitchen, barely noticing the distant rumble of engines outside. Then, the sound grew louder. A deep, steady hum. Low and powerful. Margaret froze, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. The noise wasn't normal, not for her quiet neighborhood. Curious, she walked toward the window and pulled back the curtain. Her breath hitched. 10 sleek, black luxury cars lined the narrow street in front of her apartment building. Their polished exteriors gleamed under the dim glow of the streetlights. They weren't just any cars. These were the kind of vehicles you only saw in movies, the kind driven by CEOs, celebrities, or people with an intimidating amount of power. She wasn't the only one watching. Shadows flickered behind the neighboring windows. Curtains twitched as curious faces peeked out, whispering. Margaret's heart pounded against her ribs. Who were they? What did they want? A sudden, firm knock on her door made her jump. Her breath caught in her throat. The knocking came again, steady, unhurried, confident. She hesitated, gripping the doorknob. Should she open it? Call someone? But who? Taking a deep breath, she turned the knob and pulled the door open. Standing before her, dressed in a sharp, immaculate suit, was Isaac Combs. Margaret's eyes widened. He looked even more imposing than he had in the park, though the color had returned to his face, and his presence radiated strength. Behind him, his personal assistant stood, holding a large envelope. Isaac's lips curled into a knowing smile. "Margaret, we need to talk." For a moment, she just stared, struggling to process what was happening. The man she had saved hours ago, the one who had been on the brink of death, was now standing in front of her, alive, breathing, and apparently very powerful. She swallowed. "Mr. Combs." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. Please, call me Isaac. She stepped aside hesitantly, allowing them in. Isaac walked in with ease, his assistant following behind. The contrast was almost laughable, his tailored suit and polished shoes against her tiny apartment's worn-out furniture and chipped paint. Margaret cleared her throat, trying to gather herself. What's going on? Isaac turned to her, his expression suddenly serious. I don't take chances with the people who saved my life. He nodded toward his assistant, who stepped forward, extending the envelope. Margaret hesitated before taking it. The paper was thick, expensive. She slid her finger under the flap and pulled out a document. Her eyes scanned the first line. A check for $500,000. Her hands trembled. She read it again. And again. $500,000. Her gaze snapped back to Isaac. I can't accept this. He tilted his head, amused. You can. And you will. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes. She had lost everything today, her job, her security, her future. But here he was, offering her something unimaginable. She clenched her jaw, fighting the overwhelming emotions rising inside her. Then she wept. Not quiet tears, not a controlled sniffle, but deep, raw, uncontrollable sobs. Isaac didn't say a word. He simply stood there, watching as Margaret collapsed onto the couch, clutching the check in her trembling hands. For the first time since she had been fired, since she had stepped out of that hospital, she didn't feel lost. She felt seen. Before Isaac left her apartment that night, he handed her a sleek black card with gold lettering. Join me for dinner tomorrow. 7 o'clock. I'll have a car pick you up. Margaret hesitated, still overwhelmed by the events of the day, but he simply smiled. Please. Just dinner. And just like that, he was gone, leaving behind a check for $500,000 and 1,000 unanswered questions. The following evening, Margaret sat in the back of a luxury black car, her fingers nervously twisting together. The ride through the city was smooth, the streets illuminated by golden streetlights. When the car finally stopped, she stepped out and stared at the towering glass building before her. A restaurant? No, this was a palace. A valet greeted her with a nod. The moment she stepped inside, the hushed elegance of the place wrapped around her. Soft music played, chandeliers glittered overhead, and the scent of exquisite cuisine filled the air. Every table was adorned with white linen, delicate glassware, and candles flickering gently. She felt out of place. Isaac was already seated in a private section near the large glass windows overlooking the city. He looked up as she approached, a satisfied smile curving his lips. Right on time. Margaret slid into the seat across from him, suddenly hyper-aware of how underdressed she felt. Her simple blue dress, though neat, wasn't exactly high fashion. Meanwhile, Isaac blended effortlessly into this world of wealth and power, his suit perfectly tailored, his demeanor calm and commanding. I have to admit, I almost didn't come, she said, voice steady despite her nerves. Isaac chuckled, lifting his wine glass. I wouldn't have blamed you. A waiter arrived, pouring wine into her glass before setting down a plate of appetizers. Everything looked delicate, expensive, almost too perfect to eat. Margaret, Isaac began, folding his hands on the table. Tell me something. What is it that drives you? What do you want most in life? She frowned slightly, taken aback by the question. I just want to help people. That's why I became a nurse. He nodded, watching her intently. And yet, you risked your entire career for a stranger. Her throat tightened at the memory. I couldn't just stand there and watch someone die. Isaac leaned forward, his gaze sharp. That's exactly why you're here. Margaret blinked, confused. What do you mean? He smiled slightly, swirling his wine. What if I told you I own a chain of private hospitals? Her eyes widened. The name Combs, she had heard it before, but never made the connection. He wasn't just wealthy. He was powerful. Isaac continued. For the last few years, I've been looking for someone different. Someone with integrity. Someone who cares more about people than policies. He took a slow sip of his wine. I tested countless doctors, administrators, and medical professionals. Most hesitated. Many turned a blind eye. But you, his eyes met hers, unwavering. You acted. Without hesitation. Without knowing who I was. That's exactly the kind of person I need. Margaret's heart pounded. Need for what? Isaac set his glass down. I want you to run a new medical initiative. Fully funded. Your call. Build a team. Set the rules. No bureaucracy. Just medicine. Margaret's mind spun. This had to be a dream. I don't understand. Her voice wavered slightly. You're offering me a hospital? Isaac chuckled. I'm offering you a purpose. A platform to do what you do best, without anyone holding you back. The weight of the moment pressed down on her. Was this real? Could she even say yes? She had lost everything just a day ago. Now, she was being handed the chance of a lifetime. Isaac sat back, watching her carefully. So, Margaret, what do you say? Margaret sat alone in her tiny apartment, the dim glow of a single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. The city outside was alive, car horns blaring, distant laughter echoing through the streets. But inside, everything was silent. On the small wooden table in front of her lay the check. $500,000. $500,000. Her fingers traced the edges of the paper, but she couldn't bring herself to pick it up. She had never seen so many zeros in her life. It was enough to change everything. To move out of this cramped apartment, to never have to worry about bills, to start fresh anywhere in the world. And yet, it didn't feel real. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting to the ceiling as memories flooded her mind. She thought of the hospital, the sterile smell of disinfectant, the rhythmic beeping of monitors, the helpless eyes of patients who depended on people like her. She thought of the moment that had cost her everything, the gunshot victim bleeding out on the hospital bed, the way her hands trembled before steadying with resolve, the way her colleagues had stood frozen in fear, unwilling to act. She had made a choice. She had known the consequences, and she had done it anyway. Margaret exhaled slowly, her gaze returning to the check. It wasn't about the money. It never had been. Her mind drifted to Isaac, the way he had watched her at dinner, not with judgment, but with curiosity, like he had been testing her, measuring something beyond her skills, something deeper. I don't take chances with the people who saved my life, he had said. Now, she finally understood what he meant. Margaret rubbed her hands over her face, exhaustion settling into her bones. This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. She could take the money, disappear, start over somewhere new. She could leave behind the chaos, the stress, the sacrifices. Or she could step into the unknown, a hospital with no bureaucracy, a place where rules didn't get in the way of saving lives, a chance to build something that mattered. She thought of the elderly woman who had held her hand after a difficult diagnosis, the young boy who had once drawn her a picture in crayon, calling her the best nurse in the world, the families who had thanked her, tears in their eyes, for doing nothing more than caring. Margaret closed her eyes. This wasn't about a paycheck. It was about purpose. Her decision was made. The sun had barely begun to rise when Margaret reached for her phone. The city was still half asleep, the streets outside quiet except for the occasional hum of passing cars. She took a deep breath, then dialed the number on the business card Isaac had left her. The phone barely rang twice before his voice came through, smooth and alert despite the early hour. Margaret, she swallowed, gripping the phone tightly. I'm in. A pause, then a quiet chuckle. Good choice. Margaret exhaled, her chest feeling strangely lighter. For the first time since she had walked out of that hospital, she didn't feel lost. She felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Months had passed, but it still felt surreal. Margaret stood at the entrance of a gleaming, state-of-the-art hospital, her heart pounding as she stared at the plaque mounted beside the glass doors. Margaret Health Initiative, saving lives without limits. Her name, her vision. The early morning sun reflected off the modern building, its sleek design a symbol of something revolutionary, a place where no one would be turned away. No red tape, no waiting for approval, just medicine, just healing, just people helping people. Margaret inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of this moment. She had started this journey as a simple nurse, someone who had been fired for making the right choice. And now, she was about to change lives in ways she had never imagined. As she stepped inside, a rush of emotions swelled in her chest. The reception area was warm and inviting, unlike the cold, sterile lobbies of most hospitals. The walls were adorned with soft artwork instead of harsh warning signs. Natural light spilled through large windows, making everything feel alive. She walked down the hallway, taking in the sight of doctors and nurses moving with purpose, but not with fear. There were no whispered conversations about insurance approvals. No patients being ignored because of financial status. Just care, the way it was meant to be. In one room, a young boy smiled weakly as a nurse adjusted his fore. His mother, relieved, squeezed his hand. In another, an elderly man chatted with a doctor who took his time listening, really listening. Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat. This was why she had fought. This was why she had said yes. A familiar voice pulled her from her thoughts. Quite a sight, isn't it? She turned to find Isaac Combs standing beside her, hands tucked into his pockets. His suit, as always, was immaculate, but there was something different in his expression. Pride. Respect. Margaret smiled. It's more than I ever dreamed. Isaac studied her for a moment, then nodded toward the hallway. Walk with me. They strolled together through the new facility, watching his life unfolded around them. I knew you were the right choice, Isaac said after a pause. The moment you put your career on the line for a stranger, I knew. Margaret glanced at him. I didn't do it for recognition. He smirked. I know. That's why you're here. They stopped in front of a glass door leading to a private office, her office. Inside, a sleek desk sat waiting, medical journals neatly stacked beside a laptop. A fresh stethoscope rested on the desk surface, as if inviting her to pick it up and get to work. Isaac gestured toward the door. Are you ready? Margaret took a deep breath, looking around at the hospital she had helped create. She had lost everything once, but in doing so, she had gained more than she ever imagined. She met Isaac's gaze and smiled, stepping forward. More than ever. As the door closed behind her, the screen faded to black. Sometimes, losing everything is the first step to gaining more than you ever imagined.